So this session, if you can't read it right on the schedule, is all about electric vehicles. So my name is on the session. That's probably why there's so few people here right now. I actually won't be speaking, so that's good news, but maybe. And I'm going to be handing over to two guys who know a lot more about electric vehicles than I do. So I think yesterday, obviously, you're all aware there's a big announcement. Geotab had acquired but really partnered with Fleet Karma. So we've got Eric here from Fleet Karma. He's going to tell you guys all about. I certainly have had a ton of questions about what this means for you all as resellers and partners. So Eric's going to come up here and tell you a little bit about everything that they do, what they'll be bringing in terms of new capabilities to Geotab resellers, things like that. And then also subsequent to that, we have Ryan from Sawatch Group, who's a partner, an official Geotab marketplace partner. They do some really interesting things from an EV analytics standpoint. So, so Eric's going to start up, and then Ryan's going to go and talk a little bit about some of the cool things that he enables via the marketplace. And then at the end, like all the sessions, hopefully we'll leave about 15 minutes for some Q&A, and I'll just hand the mic around. So without further ado, Eric from Fleet Karma.
We're good. Okay. First of all, Jean, you stole my joke about why there's a light attendance for the session, but that's okay. I'll probably get used to that over time. But in all seriousness, I appreciate you coming out and wanting to learn a little bit more about electric vehicles and what we're up to. So I'm happy to share some time today on that. So the title of the presentation is ROI That Makes You Smile, Telematics for Fleets That Are Electrifying. So why ROI that makes you smile? First, let me ask, by show of hands, has anybody heard of the term the EV smile? Does anybody know what that is? The EV smile. No? Any guesses what that might be, the EV smile? Has anybody driven a Tesla?
First time you fill up your car. Or not.
Or when you drive by a gas station and realize you don't have to go there anymore? So the EV smile usually actually refers to the first time when you're at 0 speed and you stomp on the accelerator to the ground and it just launches you with full torque from 0 speed. So you get this instant smile on your face. And so I associate a lot of positivity to EV ownership and having EVs. But when you work with fleet managers, there's sort of a range of emotions, let's say. And what we try to do historically at Fleet Karma is bring a lot of positivity to that experience and try to make it a lot easier for them. So sometimes they might have a mandate to get electric vehicles and they're disgruntled and they don't want to do it and they don't know how they're going to do it and they're really stressed about everything else they have to do. And sometimes they're really progressive and they're excited about it. So there's sort of this range, but we want to help them see the ROI that electric vehicles can bring to their organization. And bring some positivity around that. So that's why I titled the presentation, ROI That Makes You Smile, and I'll come back to that as we go. So there's a quote that I really like from the CEO at Daimler, who once said that electric mobility is like an upside-down ketchup bottle. You know, at some point something will come out, you don't know when, but when it comes, it really does. So I like this a lot because it applies to a lot of the work we do. We work with fleets, obviously. We also work with utilities a lot and help them prepare for electric mobility through some smart cities, smart grid stuff. And my colleague Mark Goody, who's here in the third row, he'll be speaking at 3 o'clock on a panel with Jean about that work. So I'll focus on the fleet stuff. But I thought a little bit more preparing for this presentation about this ketchup analogy. And I thought, you know, for the last 30 years, I always thought the best way to get ketchup out of a ketchup bottle was to smack the bottom of it and hope that it comes out. And it's actually probably not the best way. So I found online, actually, there's all sorts of different techniques to doing this. And what I kind of realized is that when I thought about that analogy about, you know, eventually electric mobility is going to come, what Fleet Karma has been trying to do is speed up that process in the work that we're doing. And we're really excited, of course, to be working with Geotab now to do that. And so my favorite technique that I learned is, you know, gently encouraging by tapping the bottleneck of the ketchup bottle to get it out. And so I think that's kind of like what we would do, to kind of encourage these fleet managers along the path to electric mobility. So I'll come back to that again a little bit later. So what fleets are electrifying? So the ones that are most common, even in the few days that I've been here with the Geotabbers, is that a thing, Geotabbers? Did I just make that up? It is?
It is now.
It is, cool, I like it. Now I'm a Geotabber too, I like it. Very common thing is government fleets and utility fleets as well. So utilities are often setting goals or objectives around showing leadership. If they could get electric vehicles, others can as well. They want to encourage electric vehicle adoption. So we work with a lot of the big utilities in Canada and the US. Southern California is one of them, for example. So there's some government fleets at all levels. We work with the Department of Defense. So does Geotab's really funny. We have we weren't really competing, but there's a project where we each sort of got half of it, and now we have all of it, which is fantastic. So various work with the Department of Defense, the Air Force bases, the Navy, that sort of thing. There's state governments, municipal governments. I was in Neil's session yesterday around Sourcewell or the NJPA and talking about the importance of municipal government. So even at Fleet Karma, we really realize there are a lot of opportunities to electrify in the municipal government. So the motivators are different for all these governments. Sometimes they have like an executive order or a senior mandate. Sometimes you have really progressive fleet managers that want to make an environmental difference. But there's more than just these common ones that I kind of want to highlight. One that I've been talking a little bit about the last day or two here at the conference is in Europe, particularly in the UK and Netherlands, but I think in some other markets too, but those two in particular. There's a lot of these plug-in hybrids. This Mitsubishi Outlander plug-in hybrid, which just came to Canada and the US this year, was really, really popular over the last 3 or 4 years, really flooded the market through leasing companies. And the way they priced this vehicle was that after the government incentive, it was basically on par with the diesel equivalent. And there were favorable tax benefits if people chose this vehicle on the vehicle selector list from their employer rather than the diesel version, meaning they would pay less taxable benefit of having a company car. So that's not really how we do things here in North America, but in Europe, it created a huge swell. So all the allocation of these vehicles in Europe, or went to Europe. They didn't come to North America. So for years, Canadians have been like, bring me an SUV that plugs in. And now we finally just got one because all the allocation was going to Europe. So one of the challenges that we identified when we were talking to folks over there is that a lot of the folks that picked that car, they would just drive it on petrol, they call it, or gas, and not ever plug it in because they would have to pay the electricity at home. So they didn't have a good home reimbursement strategy for all the charging to do at home. So it became an ongoing problem. So we're really excited about trying to solve that problem. And we think now it's even more possible, of course, working together with Geotab. A couple other types of fleets that I wanted to highlight that I thought were really interesting from our portfolio. These are two of my favorite. One on the left here is Teo Taxi. This is in Montreal. So they have almost 200 electric vehicles now, some Teslas in their fleet. And we monitor all these vehicles and help them dispatch the vehicles in intelligent ways, understanding what the battery state of charge is, where people need to go, and figuring out what's the right vehicle for each job in a real-time setting. So Newt Cargo, the G is silent, Newt Cargo. Love the last mile. I heard people talk about last mile a little bit this week. They're a great electric vehicle fleet in central London. They have just under 100 electric vehicles running around, these cargo vans. So I'd love to see these cargo vans come to North America as well. These are Nissan EMV 200s, and they have quite a few of them as well. And they're doing great things. So these fleets are kind of blazing a trail of building the business model of what an electric fleet can look like, and all 100% electric fleet. So it's really exciting to see those ones. So we really try to focus on two core objectives in working with fleets. One is increase EV adoption. We do that through what we call an EV suitability assessment or EV suitability analysis. And the second one is to maximize EV ROI. And so historically, we've called this EV monitoring, and I'll show you some of the things that the technology enables in terms of delivering maximum EV ROI. But focusing on increasing EV adoption with fleets, I just want to kind of highlight whether it's folks at Geotab or the resellers or Fleet Karma or probably any other telematics company. I think when we're talking to fleet managers, we typically talk about sort of managing behavior a lot. So what's the slogan? Manage what you can measure. Manage, what is it? Management by measurement. I'll have to learn that one, obviously. So it's a lot around behavior management. But what we realized when we're talking to organizations about increasing EV adoption, there's a lot of other folks that get involved, particularly in the sustainability department or energy department. And the way that sustainability and energy managers think about conservation or efficiency is behavior management and technology switching. So you could look at a facility, for example, and think, okay, we could try to get everybody to turn off the lights when they leave a room, or we can install LED light bulbs, and that will introduce more energy conservation and efficiency. So that's sort of how they think. They do these energy audits, and the way that we have worked with them is through this EV suitability assessment to say, like an energy audit for your fleet, leveraging telematics data, we could identify where technology switching actually makes sense and where behavior management is a good fit. So when we look at some of the stats in terms of CO2 reductions for a sustainability manager that's trying to achieve CO2 reduction, smoother driving, less harsh braking, less harsh acceleration. From a reduction of CO2 perspective, it can move the needle a little bit, preventing unnecessary idling a little bit more, but really deploying hybrids and electric vehicles is where they could realize a ton of low carbon benefit in their fleet. So folks that have like a real serious mandate over the next 3, 5, 10 years of reducing and decarbonizing their fleet, hybrid electric vehicles is the way that they're going to achieve it. But new technology brings uncertainty, and it's a little bit scary for some folks. And one thing I've come to appreciate over the last 7 years in this business is that for a fleet manager, reliability is king. In finance, we say cash is king. Reliability is king for a fleet manager. If the vehicles aren't reliable, if folks are concerned about using them, they're not going to have success. So we need to bring some reliable data and bring confidence in the ability for them to plan. So let me share some of that data with you. Here's some data we took from a long time ago. This is from public sector fleets, and these are ICE vehicles, or vehicles that run on gasoline. You see a fairly normal distribution of the daily utilization of these vehicles, and about half of the utilization was under 40 miles per day, or 63 kilometers a day. We compared that to how battery electric vehicles, these are ones that run fully on electric vehicles, were used for early adopting fleets. And we found that the graph was much more skewed to the left, obviously. So 70% of the days that we looked at, vehicles went less than 40 miles per day. So obviously, early adopting fleets were using their electric vehicles less than their gasoline vehicles. So that we thought that was a bit of a problem. We kind of dug into it a little bit more. And what we found was a lot of those early adopting fleets, they were putting their electric vehicles into a motor pool. So there are some people that think if an electric vehicle is driven in the rain that it's going to cause a problem. So there's a lot of education, of course, out there to do. But we quickly identified that there's a massive risk about putting electric vehicles in a motor pool. It's not to say it's a bad idea, it's just there's a massive risk. So I know some organizations that have put electric vehicles in a motor pool and have had tremendous success with it. It introduces the technology to their employees. It's a great strategy for that. They manage the utilization to make sure that these highly efficient vehicles from a cost and energy and emissions perspective are being used. But if you don't do that and they sit there, they're like this massive paperweight that was really expensive, and they're kind of these token green vehicles that don't get a lot of use. So we don't want to do that, because if you do that and you create these use cases like that, everybody complains that this was a failure and they're not going to get more electric vehicles, and you don't kind of create that electric vehicle adoption that we want to achieve. So this is my tongue-in-cheek way of delivering that message. What I wanted to highlight is what we developed. So Fleet Karma actually started its business actually designing electric vehicles, and we did two things that are really good as engineers designing electric vehicles. One was we're able to write control code, which now allows us to read that control code and monitor electric vehicles. So that's a skill set that we brought into the telematics technology. The other one is we would build these physics-based models of vehicles that we were designing to help OEMs understand how they would perform in the real world. We took that technology, we patented it, and we brought it into the telematics space, and we said, what if we took telematics data and put it into these software models of EVs that are production EVs, not the ones we're designing, but a Nissan Leaf or a Chevrolet Volt or Toyota Prius plug-in, whatever it is, and we're able to predict how an EV would perform in these fleet duty cycles, just like how we were predicting a prototype OEM vehicle before they even made a production version of it. So that was something that we patented with the US Patent Office, and we brought to the market about 7 years ago. And this is a video that will show you how this technology works. So highlighted in gray is a gasoline Ford Fusion. You see the blue line in miles per hour is the speed trace, or what the EPA may call the drive cycle of a vehicle. But that's a real world trip for 21 minutes. And then the fuel consumption over that 21-minute trip. When I push play in this video, I might do it over here. Yeah. What you'll see is we drive 3 different electric vehicles, the exact same speed trace or drive cycle for that 21-minute trip. And the model is able to predict how much electricity is being used, and if it's a plug-in hybrid, how much gasoline is being used in that trip over time. So we have used these models to be able to have predictive analytics in our telematics system. And over the years, we've refined this and simplified it to make it much more scalable, but it's all based on this core patented software. So when we look at if an EV is suitable, what I like to describe is sort of this Goldilocks effect. So in some cases, there are duty cycles that have a ton of utilization and becomes really problematic for some electric vehicles because they don't have enough time to charge, or they will run out of range and can't do all the jobs that a vehicle needs to do. In other cases, the vehicle is barely even used, and the payback on the premium you pay for that electric vehicle is so far out in the future, it doesn't make any sense financially to get it. But there's generally these sweet spots with different types of technology. And so I call it the Goldilocks effect. You know, not too much, not too little, but just right. Where do you get that real ROI as a fleet manager? So we've typically graphed things in this daily utilization plot. The way to understand this is from left to right is 24 hours, and each horizontal bar is a new day. So in green is all the time that the vehicle is being used, and black is when it's off. So you can see this vehicle is being used a ton, and that utilization is very high. So range capability, charge capability is going to be a major concern. Here, you see very little green, lots of black. The vehicle isn't being used as much. And this is just data visualization. Obviously, there's stats around this and analysis around this. But just looking at the visualization of it, you kind of see, oh, it's not used that much. The payback period and the ROI will probably be the concern. And then here you see a little bit more green, but not too much where you don't have enough time to charge. So here you have all this time overnight to recharge this vehicle to do all this work that it's doing during the day in green. So this is a type of analysis that's really powerful from a technology switching perspective when you leverage telematics data. So all of this becomes available in an EV suitability assessment. This is offered to fleet customers as they're using a telematics system. And we're able to strategically provide ROI by deploying EVs where they will work and not just putting them where it's easiest to deploy them from like a politics or internal politics perspective. Okay, so that covers EV suitability assessment, increasing EV adoption. The other topic, another core objective I want to highlight was maximizing EV ROI, and we do that by monitoring electric vehicles. So to do that, one thing we have to do, I talked about before, is support the electric vehicles. So if you're familiar with onboard diagnostic systems or CAN data, you'll know that some signals are standardized and some are not. So Geotab's been really good at getting like odometer information and seatbelt engaged. These are non-standard OBD signals that Geotab has decoded and incorporated into their telematics system. One thing that we really focused on over the years, of course, is getting all these electric vehicle signals. And it's really complicated because it's not just finding the signal, but making sure the device is able to handle the different moding of the vehicle and protect the vehicle systems and do it the right way. So we've supported now over 50 vehicles. I think it might even be over 60 now, with a couple more added last week. So internationally, all these different vehicles we've been working on for the various clients, mainly in the fleet sector. So I want to highlight quickly like some of the features that you can experience as a fleet manager. So if you're a reseller or somebody that's talking to fleets, this is something you might want to keep in mind. So automated odometer readings. When you have electric vehicles, sometimes a fleet will get odometer readings from their fueling system, not their telematics system. We have electric vehicles, they don't go to the fueling system, so you need another way to get odometer readings. So that's part of the decoding process to get odometer. DTC or 12-volt battery issues, just getting an alert if there's a diagnostic issue with the vehicle, the 12-volt battery is really low, or there's a light on in the dash. EV range management, real-time SOC. So this is knowing in real time what's the state of charge of your vehicle and where is it. I gave that taxi example. They know where the vehicle is. They just got a call. The taxi's going to go pick up somebody, and they want to know what the state of charge is. Or it's on plug, and it's currently charging. They could understand how much more time does it have to be fully complete. Battery health monitoring. So are you experiencing degradation in your battery pack over time? Well, we could give you that feedback. EV charging data, time of use profiles. So EV charging data is really good because lots of fleets still think, okay, I need to have the charging data, and then they will network their charging stations or meter their charging stations at an additional cost. But if they're going to get telematics anyways, and they get the charging data in the telematics system, that's an instant ROI that they don't need to go buy another system to track all their charge events. And I'll kind of show you a little bit about that. Plug-in compliance, making sure folks are plugging in as much as possible so that they're driving on electric range, particularly the plug-in hybrids. And then the traditional driving stuff around scorecards and GPS. So quickly, and we want to figure out how all this integrates, of course, with Geotab, but just to give you a sense of how we've done it over the years. Here you see a plot, dots on a map, very typical telematics experience. What vehicles are where, what's their current state of charge, are they driving, are they charging? Here we have by geofence, a region. You can see what vehicles are in that particular geofence in real time, and what their state of charge is, are they charging? So this little lightning bolt means that they're currently on plug charging. And so we have a customer in California that uses this a lot. They have motor pools, and Matt talked about it in his presentation yesterday, our CEO. Somebody would go out to the vehicle. Whenever somebody needed a vehicle, they'd have to go out to see what the state of charge is. And then when they got the system, they just literally pulled up the screen and said, okay, this vehicle's full, you take that one, and off you go. So helped with the dispatch of motor pool vehicles and making sure that vehicles are getting used when they're in the motor pool. So that's another good example of how to ensure maximum ROI from EVs is you don't want them to sit around. If you're going to get them, you got to use them because they're super efficient to use. This is just a screenshot of, do you see that daily utilization plot? Now we have blue with the green. Blue is all the charge events. We have every trip that's logged and some stats on vehicles just to monitor and evaluate the utilization and battery health. I talked about charge logs. So you don't need to network all your charging stations. Comes with your telematics, instant ROI. You don't have to pay $20 a month to network your charging station. This is a good example of a customer. On the top here, you see they only, with their Chevrolet Volt, only drove this vehicle 16% of the time on electric miles or kilometers, depending where you are. And you can see very little blue. That means they didn't charge that vehicle much. You see green, but not a lot of blue. Down below, after they introduced plug-in compliance policy and started tracking it with the system, you see much more regular blue day in and day out. They increased their electric driving to 73% of the time. They ended up saving over $60 a month just because they were plugging the vehicle. They didn't change the way they drove it. They didn't change the vehicle. They just made sure it was plugged in. So you talk about ROI of a telematics system. You do this for every plug-in hybrid. It's pretty obvious. And finally, I don't have a lot of time to talk about this today, but again, my colleague Mark will have a little bit of time at 3 o'clock to talk about the work we do with smart charging and managing EV load. So we do a lot of that with utilities in the residential sector, but certainly with fleets as well. So one of the things we look to understand is their time of day of charging. So the histogram on the bottom here kind of shows for a particular geofence all the charging that happens at a facility. So we'll geofence a parking lot and say, this is how much charging is happening at that facility. So sometimes a facility or organization will incur demand charges at their facility for charging their electric vehicle at the same time. And we don't want them to do that because it blows the total cost of ownership equation out of the water. So what we want is to spread out that charging and do that intelligently. So we have all sorts of interesting technology to do that. And incorporate it into your fleet pitch, it's really powerful when they're trying to scale up an EV fleet. So just to baseline that with a telematics system, just to understand the magnitude of that problem is really key, and then figuring out what the right solution is. So just coming back to, again, the partnership, of course, we're really excited about it. We've done a lot of work over the last 10 years to work with folks on EV opportunities and issues, and we know Geotab has always been interested in this as well. And we started to get to a point where we were talking to the same folks, and it became obvious we should just start doing this together. So it's really exciting. I just wanted to highlight how I think this is really incredible is just imagine a scenario. We have one system now that works on gasoline, diesel, and hybrid vehicles in gray, plug-in hybrid and fully electric vehicles or battery electric vehicles in blue. And year over year, we're using that telematics data to get a larger proportion of EVs into the fleet. It's such a powerful feature in a telematics system that's really exciting. Just coming back to the catch-up, so we could keep trying to change the way we interact with the bottle, but we could maybe just change the bottle, and I feel like that's what we're doing with this partnership to make it easier. So really excited about that, of course, and that's all I got for today. So thank you.
So we're just going to hold questions until the end. So we're going to let Ryan go. So obviously we're really excited about the relationship. I'm sure you guys have a lot of questions. Really the focus of that portion of the presentation is to educate you guys a little bit on the capabilities of Fleet Karma, and then obviously what we'll be bringing to the overall ecosystem, right? So I'm sure this just scratched the surface, but some really interesting things. And from a government perspective, if you're not already aware, there's a huge number of legislature. At the federal level, there's executive orders. At the state levels, there's a whole bunch of regulations around EV adoptions, and certainly kind of across the country and here in Canada as well. So you're going to continue to come across electric vehicles, hopefully more and more. So please make sure, after the session, you can reach out to the government BD team, and we can make some introductions to the Fleet Karma team. Just make sure you guys are up to speed on kind of these new features and functionalities, because ideally, they'll be a large part of your pitch decks moving forward. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Ryan Daly. So Ryan, as I mentioned earlier, I think that's right, yeah. Ryan, as I mentioned earlier, he's the CEO for Sawatch Group. They're an official marketplace partner. They do some really, really interesting work from an EV analytics standpoint. So if you're looking, you have the government BD team, obviously, to help you in some of these sales opportunities. But if you're looking for a partner to come in and do some really customized EV analytics work, maybe act as almost a consultative partner to stand next to you in some of these meetings, Ryan does some really interesting work in this space, and I think he's going to go through some of it here.
Great.
Over to you, buddy.
Thanks, John. You can hear me okay on the mic? Okay, awesome. Thanks everybody for coming this afternoon. We're also excited about the Fleet Karma acquisition. I think we do a lot of things that are complementary, and we're looking forward to learning from them. Been familiar with their product for a long time, so I think it's just really exciting for all of us who've been working in electric vehicles for a while. And so spend a little bit of time talking about how we approach things that are kind of in a complementary nature, but then kind of talk a little bit more about the larger ecosystem for electric vehicles. So the kind of philosophy that we came into this with when we got into some consulting projects a few years ago was that telematics was really underutilized in this portion of fleet management, informing the procurement of new technologies so that fleet managers make the right decision about which vehicles to bring into the fleet at which points in time, making sure they maximize their ROI, and that they've got the use cases right. So we applied analytics and data science on top of telematics data. And then we've really focused on using that to inform procurement and the supply chain. So as we talk about helping fleets now, I think as we get better at this and get a little bit bigger and stronger in the EV space, I think we are then also informing the charging side of the industry. Utilities were already mentioned, and then the vehicle manufacturers, and eventually the next generation of EVs that are going to come onto the market to support fleets and consumers. So what we do, kind of looking at EV suitability in a similar manner, is through a product that we call Easy EV. So it's a data source agnostic software platform that sits on top of your existing telematics data. And we're looking for a couple of things in the drive cycle and profile of a vehicle. Number one is obviously energy use. How much energy does this vehicle need to use? Is it going to be able to get through its entire drive cycle in a day with a single charge? Or is it going to need access to charging during the middle of the day so that drivers can get home? And then complementary to that, speed profile of the vehicles. Where are they driving? Are they on the interstates? Are they in an urban environment? And how's that going to impact energy use and range? And then the efficiency of the driver. And this is a number of factors, but really gets down to driving behavior. Do we have more or less aggressive drivers? And is that going to impact how they would act in a new technology? So we kind of roll those all into one and then provide a single score for particular vehicles. And then we can help a fleet manager walk through which vehicles are going to be good for a transition and not. And I think, probably the one big differentiator between us is, we saw the Geotab marketplace and really just loved the opportunity that enabled for us to reach a lot more fleets more quickly. And so we're in the final stages of wrapping up our marketplace integration, getting through our data security protocols. But for the fleets that we are working with, we're able to kind of patch this in behind the scenes right now. We've got a couple of projects that are getting kicked off right now. And so they can have access to this going forward. And I think the really neat thing is literally when we flip the switch and our analytics hit their API, we grab the last 90 days worth of data immediately, work with you guys to maybe get that a little bit further back as well. But we get a pretty instant picture of what's going on with your existing fleet customers. And so that's been really valuable for those folks we've worked with who already have Geotab. The other cool thing that we've been able to do is kind of use this engagement on the EV side as an additional selling tool for telematics. So it's kind of a way to get them hooked if they're not quite bought in, but they're thinking about this electric vehicle side of things as well. So kind of use the complementary nature of both the sustainability and the EV adoption side of things to then transition the larger fleet onto the Geotab platform and get a larger project out there. So that's where we're headed with marketplace integration. And then this is a similar chart to what Eric was showing. And what I want to highlight in this as well is the decision-making process for fleets around charging infrastructure. So we've worked with a number of fleets, and we see kind of the same horror stories and the same kind of guiding mentality. And that's they tend to think that they need one level 2 charger to support every electric vehicle that comes into the fleet. So that's a 240 volt plug like you would have for your dryer. And that requires special hardware, and it may require some upgrades to a facility to support that. And so it's really important to understand how the installation of those higher capacity chargers impacts the project cost overall. And whether or not vehicles necessarily need to have that higher charge, or if they're spending enough time sitting in a single location overnight, can they just plug into a regular wall socket and charge on a level 1 charge? And so this was a client that we were working with last year, and basically we had a situation where we've got one vehicle up on top, and it's leaving this particular parking lot every morning around 6 o'clock. It does a little bit of driving, and then it parks at this other facility, the orange one, lot 1, about a similar time every day. And then this other vehicle leaves that facility shortly thereafter, opening up this nice big window between 8 a.m. and 2 p.m. where it's not using its parking space and not using the charger that could be there, while this other vehicle could come in and charge up during the day when it would need to. And then overnight, each of them were going back to their respective facilities and sitting for more than 16 hours overnight. And so when we talked to this fleet manager, we said, well, at most, you need one level 2 charger to support both of these vehicles. In reality, you could probably get away with level 1 to support both of them, but if you really want to have that extra capacity, don't spend the money to get 2 chargers, just get the one for now. Within that, though, there's kind of the larger story. This is 2 vehicles, at 2 different facilities. When you start thinking about this in terms of dozens or hundreds of vehicles, then you do have to factor in kind of that additional capacity down the line. And as they start to transition, 2, 5, 10% of the fleet, a few chargers now is going to be great, but if you're going to install them now, you want to take the time to go ahead and prep for the future. And that's to go ahead and lay the electrical infrastructure that's going to be needed to add future chargers down the line, even though you're knowing that you're not going to make that entire expenditure right now. And the big thing we're trying to avoid, and we saw it last week, and I'm not gonna throw anybody under the bus, but I did see a nice large group of new Nissan Leafs kind of sitting in a parking lot waiting for level 2 charging to go in. And they could be operating now on level 1. They may not get kind of their full operational needs out of the way immediately, but they're kind of just sitting there. And I think the big thing that those of us who've been around in the alternative fuels and electric vehicle industry for a long time have seen is kind of that repeated horror story where the technology is put into a bad use case or the lowest risk use case. And then the vehicle's utilization is not maximized. It's not there. It's not doing what it's intended to do. They're not going to get a return on their investment. Fleet manager has a bad experience with it and then doesn't want to adopt any more vehicles. And so we really want to make them feel comfortable that they're going to put these vehicles into the right use case, they're going to be utilized the way that they're intended, and nobody's going to sacrifice any operational need with the new technology, right? So it's kind of like due diligence in a lot of ways to make them feel comfortable with the adoption of new technologies. So in a similar manner, thinking about infrastructure, we have started to look at kind of system level analytics and how you're going to support these vehicles across the transportation system, across corridors, and that enables a larger geographic range in which these vehicles can operate. So this is actually just a snapshot of a project we just finished in partnership with some folks in Ohio and the Turnpike over there. And they came to us and said, you know, we know that this is coming. How do we maximize our initial investment in infrastructure at Turnpike service plazas to enable travel across the state of Ohio? And so what we did is we think about aggregating telematics data. So all the data that we have access to across all the vehicles and not just individual fleets, we can start to get a sense of what demand is going to look like at particular locations, given current adoption rates of electric vehicles, which is pretty low, and then what that's going to look like over time. And so in Ohio, it was pretty interesting. They had kind of thought intuitively, you know, they've got kind of matching service plazas. There's, I think, 14 of them, so 7 different locations, and there's one eastbound and westbound. And they thought, well, we'll just put them at, you know, they kind of randomly selected these places, one eastbound, one westbound. We started to look at the data. What we realized is actually the opposite is what they need to do, and they needed to stagger them, and they needed to be staggered differently eastbound and westbound. Because what they really, the majority of their traffic flow was between Cleveland and Toledo. That was something like 60–70% of their traffic flow across the Turnpike was supporting those travel patterns between those two cities. And so we kind of assume that if you're leaving Cleveland, headed to Toledo, you should have a full charge, and that you're not going to need to charge again until you get closer to Toledo. So you don't need a westbound charger right outside of Cleveland. Similarly, going the other direction, you want to charge up from Toledo going to Cleveland that last 20–30 miles before you get there. That was really cool because we helped them optimize their initial investment, and they're looking at, you know, only 4 chargers that are going to go at staggered toll plazas. But the other cool thing about that is then they start talking to their neighbors. Turnpikes in Indiana, the Turnpike in Pennsylvania, and then you start thinking about enabling interstate travel and supporting the system. And so I think this is one of the really interesting possibilities that that we have by being geotabbers and aggregating data that we have access to. So this is something that's really exciting, and exploring this with a couple of other states right now as well. The last piece that I want to end on is the regulatory side of things. So this is the world that I kind of got my start in. I was at the National Renewable Energy Lab in Golden, Colorado for about 6 years, and I oversaw the federal fleet program there. So they've got federal requirements that are law, they've got executive orders, some of the agencies have their own internal requirements. Department of Defense is a really interesting one. They want to do this for energy security as much as they want to do it for sustainability. But there's also federal requirements on states, state fleets, and utility fleets. Then within that, states have their own regulations. Municipalities have their own regulations. And when we talk about the public sector, this is really where it's kind of been our bread and butter, because they have the political will to look at and prove out the capabilities of electric vehicles. And that kind of builds a nice little ecosystem for us to serve while the private sector kind of sees what happens and then, you know, will kind of come along in the end. And so in that, these are some of the folks that we've worked with over the course of the last year. The National Renewable Energy Lab, again, they kind of have responsibility for oversight of some of those federal regulations. But as the feds have kind of put less money into this in the last 2 years, the support that they would traditionally provide is starting to ramp down a little bit. And I think that opens a really nice place for us to serve fleets who still want to do this because they still have the political will to get it done. So it's opening up a nice place in the market for us to do that. And then the other thing that we see as a result of the feds kind of taking a step back is that municipalities in particular are really kind of picking up the torch. Cities are leading the charge, where states and the feds may not be taking that leadership role. And so some of you may or may not have seen this, but the city of Los Angeles convened, initially it was 4 cities on the East Coast, into a request for information to see what the industry could provide them in terms of electric vehicles. In the last 2 years, they've, I think, added like 400 cities that are interested in throwing their name into the hat to say, yes, we want these vehicles too. Industry, please provide them to us. So cities are really picking up the mantle, and there's a lot of opportunity for us in that regard. And even where there may not be specific regulations, there's a political will to do it. So for any of the resellers that are in the room, I would encourage you to, one, go after these public sector entities, and any that you are already working with, we've kind of got a shovel-ready opportunity to serve their needs. So with that, I will stop, and I think we can open it up for questions.
Yeah, awesome. So if there are any questions, I'll pass around a mic. I've said it a few times already today. It doesn't actually make you sound any louder. It's just for the recording, the video recording, so don't be surprised if you think it's actually turned off. Yep. Hang on, I'll bring it over.
So I'm totally new to this space, so this may be a naive question, but as a motorist driving an electric vehicle, how do I know where these electric charging stations are? Are there telematics that tell me, 30 miles ahead I have a charging station, or how do I find it?
Well, the kind of main place that we go is that the Department of Energy in the U.S. does have kind of a centralized database. It's not foolproof and it's not 100% accurate, but so there's apps that do it. So the Department of Energy has one. The charging networks themselves also have them. I think a large part of what we need to do, as Geotab and Fleet Karma come into this is think about how we integrate it into the fleet product as well, and then we can give feedback preemptively to drivers on that. So yeah, right now it's kind of been outsourced to a number of different parties, but I think it's a good opportunity for us to figure out how to integrate that information. Usually subscription-based. So individuals can buy a subscription to one of a couple of different charging networks. It's evolving.
So there's a few. So I think some will take credit card as well, and they're trying to create interoperability to have like a single card across networks. So they're working on it. This is getting better, over the years. One of the things that we were looking at. So I presented EV suitability assessments for fleets. We've been doing this for individuals now as well through different channels, and we're kind of exploring. What are the questions that prospective EV owners are trying to ask? You just asked one of them, where am I going to charge this vehicle? That's one common one. Another one is how much is it going to cost? And then where can I get one of these vehicles? Like who actually has one from a dealer perspective? So we've created this program that we're working with some early partners on. And what we could do with the telematics data is we could show, okay, this is where you commonly park your vehicles, like the top 2 or 3 locations. So maybe your home or your workplace or another popular location. What charging stations are in a certain radius from those commonly parked locations? And how far can your vehicle go from those commonly parked locations? So we start to think, what is the prospective EV buyer asking? How can telematics help answer those questions? So there are some tools right now that when you're an EV owner, you can answer them, but even before you're an EV owner, when you're worried about these things, how could telematics help answer those questions as well?
And I'll add to that on the fleet side. I know we've at least heard anecdotally from other fleets that the charging network companies are working with the fuel card providers, with Voyager and Ride Express, to make sure that they can integrate the fuel card with charging. I don't know exactly what the status of that is, but I do know they've at least been working on it.
You mentioned that you can use the telematics to initiate the tech switch and then also help control the driver behavior, and you want to have a good plug-in policy. What is a good plug-in policy?
So basically, the common duty cycle for an EV is it'll do work during the day and it will charge overnight. So in those common scenarios, you basically want to make sure every night it gets a full recharge. So what we could look at is, what is the average starting SOC on the first trip of every day? So if that is like 90%, 95%, 99%, it's pretty good. If that's like 51%, 48%, 23%, that's terrible. So just that one indicator could tell us that the first trip of every day, they're not starting with a full recharge, and that's as bad. You're throwing money away. The emissions profile is worse. So a good plug-in compliance policy is every night the vehicle should be recharged. The exception to that is you have some vehicles, like in an airport application or certain applications where you got to be more opportunistic and you got to think a little more creatively around how you manage charging. But generally, that's pretty rare. So it's more about that overnight charging.
So on a car that's completely electric, right? My understanding is that it takes less energy to charge the first 80% of the battery and more energy to charge the last 20%, 10%, 5%. So with that strategy of plug it in every night, doesn't it cost you more to plug it in every night versus understanding your usage and plugging it in every other night?
So this is a good question. What will actually happen sometimes when you're charging an electric vehicle, to protect the battery, the vehicle is smart enough with its controllers to slow down the rate of charge after 80%. So the amount of energy, when you think of energy as kilowatt hours, it's actually going to be the same because it's going from 80 to 100. So let's call that 6 kilowatt hours, whatever it is, depending on the battery size. So the amount of energy is going to be the same, but the rate is going to change. So the kilowatts that you're putting into the battery over that portion of the recharge will go down, and it'll take a little more time. So it's not energy, it'll just take a little more time. So the cost element is probably not impacted unless it's like some crazy time of use thing that you're going into cheaper or more expensive periods, but generally holding that constant, it won't be a cost element, but there's a time consideration there that you might want to think about for sure.
So I have a question about product mix that you've seen. So you gave a lot of references, whether it's the Chevy Bolt or the Nissan. Are you also involved in other vehicle classes, whether those are light-duty service vehicles or shuttles or even buses that are part of these fleets for government or other?
Yeah, for sure. So every vehicle class from 1 to 8, we've had devices on, whether those are gasoline, diesel, hybrid, or electric. Some examples, we participated in a smart charging program in the UK. Actually, it was across multiple jurisdictions, but in the UK, they had UPS Class 5 step vans running around central London, and we had devices on those. An organization that doesn't exist anymore, but they had a lot of Class 5 delivery trucks called Smith Electric or Smith Newton vehicles. So Staples had a bunch, Frito-Lay had some. So it's funny because Fleet Karma and Geotab sort of had similar customers, but we were doing a lot of these EV programs. And electric transit buses are pretty big now, Proterra, BYD, some other ones. School buses, so we have devices in some school bus. We're trying to get another project now. So there's a mix. The other one that I didn't touch on in my slide that's a really good one is bucket trucks or the cherry pickers for the utilities. So they electrify that boom, called an EPTO, so power takeoff system. So you electrify that. It's really quiet for the operator. They really like it. There's no emissions because you don't have to run the diesel engine to lift that boom. And that's one way that utilities are electrifying their fleet because they only have so many sedans. So they're looking at these PTO trucks, these bucket trucks, and saying, well, what if we electrify them at least at a minimum with that boom? They're idling, 60, 70% of the time, but we could run all that idling time on electric power. So we've also supported those from a suitability perspective, understanding where they fit, and monitoring the benefit of those systems when they're in the field.
I'll add to that we can do the suitability assessments. The problem is that in the larger vehicle sizes is one, product availability, and two is scale. So it's largely dominated by niche manufacturers, and there are product offerings across most vehicle classes, but there's just not the scale, reliability, service, parts that those vehicles need to service a nationwide operation. And so I think the industry needs to hear that there is demand for an electric drivetrain in those vehicles. We talked to Pepsi the other day, and they said, yeah, the demonstration projects are great, we like them, but we need something that is nationwide. We need a solution that fits our operations that we can scale so that we're not managing this tiny little subset of the fleet over here differently than we are everything else. So I think the more that industry hears that from fleets, that there's demand for that, then hopefully things pick up.
Yeah, so we have we're fortunate to have Jeff Monteshaw here as well as Tim Fitzgerald. And so I was wondering if you guys could address the crowd. Jeff, maybe just if we could start with you on just in the state of Utah, when we're all coming in, if we're all resellers and we're coming in to meet with you, and we're working with companies like we have here, which I thought was an excellent presentation, can you tell us what you'd be looking for from us in terms of questions that you may have in terms of what we can deliver for electric vehicles in your fleet? What information you'd be looking for, or what should we be talking about to someone like you at a state level, what your needs are, just that kind of thing.
Sure. I've actually talked with the CEO and Ryan already about this exactly. So I think the key coming in and talking to me is that suitability assessment, right? At least in the state of Utah, do you want me to? So I think the suitability assessment is the key. Like, that's where I would lead. Because at least in the state of Utah, and I've talked with a few of my other colleagues, we've all been burned with other things, like CNG was all the rage. We ran out. We built all these very expensive CNG fueling sites. We brought in all these CNG vehicles, and we put them across fleets, and then it didn't make sense, right? Poor performance in cold weather, or problems with fueling stations and that kind of stuff. And so it's not that the technology was bad or even that it didn't work in some cases, but it didn't work in all the cases we put them in. And so then what happened is everybody got gun shy, right? And then we were smart and we brought out a whole bunch of Nissan Leafs, but not to knock Nissan Leafs. Those first versions had performance issues too. Their ranges were very small. And so people just got burned again, and they're left stranded. And so I really think the key is that suitability assessment and saying it works here, it doesn't work here. Like, you don't normally hear that from a salesperson, right? They come in, they want to sell the whole fleet or not at all. So I would start there. So.
You got something to add, Tim, or you always have something to add, I guess.
I think that we've got to look at the suitability of the infrastructure. The infrastructure is very important. I'm around the corner, two blocks from the Department of Transportation, from all the other people that are there, and getting them to put infrastructure in place and the suitability of a mixed-use development product that covers the HPVs, covers the, even the POBs, and then creating that public-private partnership of that infrastructure is the piece, because no company on one hand wants to invest in the total infrastructure in and of itself without the partnership of the government that says, I got some land over here that I can allow you to use. And then you have the stadiums and you have, the public parking infrastructures and all of that. They all work hand in hand. It's just that on a large scale, it hasn't happened yet. And that's what needs to happen.
This kind of goes off what Tim was just starting to say. Is have you guys had or provide services to agencies that are getting into this? So both from ROI and adoption of just trying to help them show the way on identifying federal, state, local grant funding. Because obviously infrastructure cost and just bringing that into the fleet is a big issue. So trying to help show the way on what funding is available. Have you done that for as far as kind of pre-sale services before?
Yeah, so we've done some regional work with a collection of municipalities, for example, in certain states or Canadian provinces. And when we do it, sort of a regional program like that, usually that is part of it. Sometimes there's a certain incentive. For example, in California, there was public fleet pilot project, they called it. There was an additional $2,500 that fleets can get. So we partnered with an organization in California and the California Air Resources Board to deliver this service to municipalities and disadvantaged communities that were eligible for this additional rebate. And so that was beyond what most folks sort of knew about. So we have done that. It's usually through these geographical campaigns where we say, okay, this is an area where we're delivering this service, maybe with a partner, and we want to make sure they understand everything that they could take advantage of and use the data to quantify what the benefits ultimately would be.
Yeah, and I would agree with that. I'd say one organization to call out in particular in the States that kind of supports that is the Clean Cities organization out of the U.S. Department of Energy. They tend to have a really good handle on grant opportunities and funding available already. They need help then convincing the fleets to adopt the vehicles. You know, on the public or on the private sector side, we've heard recently, you know, the incentives are great, but they need to see this kind of without it. They need to see the industry exist without it. So as those start to go away, I think things change a little bit. And then on the public sector side, the thing that we've done a lot of over the course of the last year and a half to 2 years is supporting clients on the procurement side and getting public sector fleets to think about leasing more than they have in the past so that they can take advantage of some of the federal tax credit that can be passed through the leasing entity. That's something that's not typically common in the public sector, but I did want to highlight, because I know it wasn't mentioned yesterday, but NJPA, which is now Sourcewell, just closed an RFP for fleet management services. So they got, I think, 6 leasing companies put into that RFP, and they'll issue contracts here pretty soon, and that's going to enable that kind of pre-competitively solicited option for leasing services for public sector entities. Now we just got to convince the fleets to take a good look at that instead of procurement as usual. Yep.
Okay, cool. So I'm going to throw a couple people under the bus here. So if you guys have additional questions, I know there's a sprinkling of Fleet Karma people. In addition to Eric, there's Mark, Chris, and Matt. I don't know if you guys want to maybe just identify yourselves. If you guys have any additional questions, you know, feel free to ambush those guys.